Enslaved Odyssey to the West is an oddity. From the perspective of game development in 2025, the game would be considered a miracle. It's a standalone action-adventure game made on a mid to high budget. In fact, the studio behind the game, Ninja Theory, has since attempted to champion this development niche with what it referred to once as AAA indie game development. The promise of a 10 to 12 hour game that can be played and finished discreetly sounds nowadays quite appealing, and on top of this, I was aware that Enslaved was considered quite unique as well as a hidden gem. So with this in mind, I ventured into the game with rather high hopes. For this reason, I was surprised to be met with quite so many familiar elements of design that the game shares with titles that both preceded and succeeded it. For example, Enslaved contains many thematic and story concepts that were common to games of the 7th generation. A post-apocalyptic story and aesthetic, a character dynamic of protector and their ward, and themes of servitude, harshness, and the willing abnegation of freedom in the name of safety that are all part and parcel of dystopia. On top of that, keen-eyed players will definitely notice gameplay similarities also. The platforming elements that constitute the core of the game are highly reminiscent of Uncharted, with character feel and movement similar to the original infamous duology, and that's before you mention the distinct but familiar look of other games made in Unreal Engine 3. On top of all this, Enslaved takes much inspiration from the Chinese epic Journey to the West, which may be familiar to many players through either knowledge of the myth itself or other entertainment properties that draw on the story, most notably Dragon Ball. However, Enslaved also shares elements with games that were released in the years that followed it, and in this way may have been ahead of its time. This includes The Last of Us, Horizon Zero Dawn, as well as other Ninja Theory releases. I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that any of these games were definitively inspired by Enslaved, but I want to give the game its due in how it may have actually been ahead of its time. When you examine the game like this, it does get a little difficult to see exactly where the game truly stands out. If you examine more deeply, however, you might begin to notice that Enslaved attempts to take each of these elements and present them with its own little twist. Enslaved is an action-adventure game that mixes cinematic platforming with melee action gameplay, rather than the third-person shooter elements that were more common in the era. It also pulls on many other small gameplay ideas to accentuate the adventure aspect of action-adventure. This presents some difficulties when trying to describe how the game draws on the various different gameplay features, so I'll go through the game, somewhat chronologically, and describe and dissect each of these elements as they arise during the game. In its guise as a platformer, Enslaved relies on set pieces, but perhaps doesn't have quite the same horsepower in this area as some of its more notable competitors. One thing that does make Enslaved unique, however, is its basis in science fiction, making it distinct to the Uncharted, historical, mythical, or terrestrial levels and platforming sequences. In fact, Enslaved comes out of the gate swinging, utilizing one of its biggest set pieces as an introduction to many of its gameplay elements. While Enslaved doesn't have an extensive list of jaw-dropping set pieces like this first level, it definitely does have a handful. Upon inspection, this introductory level does particularly well for two reasons: its use of color, particularly the strong sky blue hues, as well as its commitment to placing urgency within its platforming. In fact, mixing other elements of its gameplay with platforming to make segments more frantic or meaningful adds a dimension to Enslaved that the original Uncharted trilogy didn't wield, which tended to rely more on pure spectacle while clambering about. The aforementioned elements of gameplay that Enslaved mixes with its platforming sequences comes from its partner mechanics, which add puzzle, stealth, or combat flavor to platforming. For example, in the early game, the player can command Trip, the game's ward or sidekick, to distract enemies while Monkey swings around behind them to dispatch them, sneak past, or complete other small objectives that allow the pair to continue forward. Ultimately, neither the stealth nor the platforming nor the combined segments are so spectacular, but it's here that you may begin to see how Enslaved begins to succeed. Early in the game, when there is less at stake and it's important to engage players, these lower octane moments actually mesh quite well with the game's narrative aspirations by allowing players to explore the post-apocalyptic setting and absorb elements of the story and lore of the world, while the mild puzzle platforming sequences subtly emphasize the two slightly conflicting personalities of the main characters who struggle to work together. Later in the game, these gameplay combinations are mixed with far more extended platforming sequences, with significant and extensive hazards which go further than most cinematic platformers without becoming an in-depth, highly technical platforming game. Now that we've discussed the gameplay area that constitutes the main early thrust of the game, let's focus on the action combat that moves more to the forefront as the game progresses. Enslaved's combat is comprised of basic light attacks, heavy attacks, charge attacks, and a basic block. Various upgrades can be earned by collecting tech orbs that are essentially the game's currency, and through this, the combat gains evades, counters, and focus attacks. While upon research, I did discover that there is extra depth to combos in the combat, for the majority of my experience with the game, I didn't require much beyond the most basic combo, and generally these are not emphasized or required by the game at all. I do want to note here how a game in this era might have attempted to pull something from Arkham Asylum, or how a game in the modern era would likely borrow much from the Soulsborne series. But instead, Enslaved actually maintains quite a degree of its own identity by relying on the studio's experience making Heavenly Sword. Eventually, and possibly inevitably for the time, Enslaved also introduces third-person shooting elements, which can also be upgraded. And so the game slowly offers more sequences that rely on stunning or shooting using Monkey's staff. There are also some enemy takedown mechanics that provide a bit of novelty as the game goes on. From this description, I hope that it's clear that these tools are not particularly deep, so they rely on sequence or scenario design to flourish. The action sequences the game offers can be divided into the following: basic action sequences or simple arena scenarios, cover shooting segments, extemporaneous hybrid sequences that pull on multiple, often novel elements of gameplay, and some boss encounters. This is not an exhaustive list of all the different gameplay elements. For example, there are also turret sections that take inspiration from third-person cover shooters of the era, but these are very methodical, not so deep, and quite rare. There are also some minor optional stealth sequences and scripted chase sequences, which are not so special either, but are there to provide a surprise. As I've hinted, the most engaging sequences are often those that take all the tools of the game and mix them together. The boss encounters, for example, while not a massive emphasis of the game, actually tend to do this quite well, but there are a few other instances in particular which I think are the strongest, and I want to try and explain why they work, because it helps to convey the charms of the game. Before I do this, however, I need to touch on the story, so let's do this now so I can tie it all together. In my opinion, one of the most commendable elements of Enslaved is the character performances, particularly Tripp, who delivers an especially strong performance. If I was to anticipate the types of criticism that the story may nowadays attract, the characters themselves might be considered not so subtle. Tripp often comes across as a somewhat naive damsel in distress, and Monkey, notable for being played by Andy Serkis, is a rather gruff, John McClane-style character who is stereotypically hulking and masculine. Nonetheless, if you are to avoid being too uncharitable, the contrast between these two characters presents the main thematic dynamic that the game explores. This might be described as something like the necessity of creating safety in a harsh world, with the fragility and perhaps naivety that might come with it, contrasted with the acceptance of and adaptation to that exact harshness that comes with a degree of enforced pragmatism that borders on nihilism. This is not a dynamic that is massively novel in the post-apocalyptic narrative space, and not one that I found so particularly interesting, but the two characters do embody this well. Monkey is a hardened survivor of the wasteland, and Trip has grown up somewhat protected in a walled garden, and their resulting worldviews are put into conflict. The game places more emphasis on a critique of Trip and her way of life, rather than the flaws potentially in Monkey's worldview. But the effect Trip has on Monkey is very clear, and he is visibly softened by his interactions with her. The plot itself is also fairly simple. It's a tale of escape and journey home, as well as the places necessary to get there, and what must happen as a result of what they find. To me, the most interesting element of this narrative and its dystopian themes is found in the early parts of the game that strongly emphasize the emergence or re-emergence of beauty in the game's derelict world. This is drawn mostly from the colourful aesthetics that make the game stand out from other games of the generation, which is famous for its greys and browns, and more importantly, making the game stand out from other dystopian games. Apart from the noticeable blue hues of the intro level, Enslaved particularly emphasizes reds and greens early in the game, which give a very tropical feeling to the regrowth that can be seen in the game's rendition of a dilapidated New York. The implication of this is that there is still opportunity for beauty to be reborn among such devastation, and the shadow this casts on the central post-apocalyptic dynamic is probably the game's most interesting thematic idea. This can also add some richness to the game's minor romantic themes. Monkey's transformation reflects this. For example, he is cast initially as a lone wolf, but the slow softening of his harsh facade, like a sort of dystopian Beauty and the Beast, moves his character towards a middle ground that balances the need for more gentle elements of community and family that are necessary to reshape an empty world, without sacrificing the need for his wilder, more dangerous and protective side. So apart from an analysis of the themes, this review so far has been largely descriptive, and that is deliberate. With a clear idea now of what the game entails, I will use two ideas to convey how the game does what it does best. The first way I want to do this is to quickly examine the game through the lens of a modern remaster, and in doing so, I hope to convey how Enslaved gets a lot right by simply not getting in its own way. By modern standards, Enslaved is still quite a smooth gameplay experience. Very few chapters drag on, and many modern tweaks to the game that I would consider necessary only involve improving frame rates in big battles, making it easier to see handholds during cinematic platforming, some minor changes to where the game deploys checkpoints, and a way to catalogue certain collectibles so that finding them is a touch easier. Beyond this, however, for an almost 15-year-old game, this is quite impressive, and any significant updates to combat or platforming would be unnecessary and would likely change the nature of the game itself. The second, more substantial idea I want to use to convey what the game does well is to introduce or discuss the idea of ludonarrative resonance. This is the opposite of a term that may be familiar to many, ludonarrative dissonance. But I wanted to explain how a game's story and gameplay may actually work together in harmony. At least on paper, the best recent example of this is Ghost of Tsushima, whose plot involves a samurai character whose identity and set of beliefs revolve around honor and a disdain for anything that might be considered dishonorable, both in life and in combat. When the Mongols invade, the idea the game hopes to convey to the player through gameplay is the strain of refusing to adapt to these new Machiavellian means when fighting these new enemies who are not playing by the same set of rules as the player. The pressure to adapt to these new, so-called dishonorable means of fighting, and the feeling of being at a disadvantage if they do not use them or update their tactics, is supposed to be felt by the player during combat and gameplay, and used to reinforce and complement or enrich the game's main thematic conflict. With this explanation in mind, I want to return to Enslaved and examine a few sequences or gameplay themes in order to convey to you how Enslaved attempts to do the same as this, though maybe on a smaller, more modest scale, that is nonetheless effective in making what seems like a relatively simple adventure stand out more. The first sequence I want to discuss is this falling bridge sequence, where the platforms are breaking beneath the player as they move upwards. Here we can see the first design idea that actually goes against the normal grain of game design, which is to have an almost totally novel mechanic or gameplay idea that is never used again. This hints at the way in which Enslaved excels. Because this sequence is novel and is never expanded upon, the idea never becomes mechanized because the parameters of success and failure never have the time to become totally clear to the player. And so the player feels a degree of uncertainty as they navigate the sequence that the game hopes manifests itself as a genuine sense of urgency. It's my opinion that for gameplay in single-player games like this, for the most part, the player largely wants to feel that failure is close, but only actually be faced by it 10 to 20% of the time. The rest of the time, I believe it's best to feel like failure is hanging over you, but to nonetheless succeed. Interestingly, this sequence actually does the same trick twice in quick succession. Not only are the platforms crumbling beneath your feet, but at a certain point, Trip asks you to help her. And so with no other option, already under pressure, you sling her onto your back and rush onwards as fast as possible. What the game has generated here is a sort of dual layer of uncertainty. And in doing this, I believe the sequence achieves the aforementioned feeling of failure being close without necessarily being confronted by it. This neatly ties back into our idea of ludonarrative resonance in two ways. It's fair to say that the feeling of uncertainty and urgency generated by this sequence is a genuine part of the spirit of adventure, but it also neatly ties in Trip's well-being. Overcoming these obstacles while protecting Monkey's ward is a necessity for us if we want to find meaning in the story that's being told. If the player does not feel some investment in protecting Trip, then the game cannot adequately convey an important element of the emotional picture that is central to one of the core themes that the game is trying to explore. This urgency is often the focus of other novel sequences that crop up here and there. In particular, there is a sequence where the player separates from Trip and the game tries to convey a sense of total panic about finding her. In this case, the urgency has its roots in the story context as well as one of the game's most prominent pieces of heart-pounding music. The level throws waves and waves of some of the game's harder enemies at the player on small, isolated funnels on the cliffside, meaning the player must fight their way through them if they are to find Trip. The level also contains a lot of shielded enemies the player must patiently and carefully stun with their charge attacks, preventing the player from wildly mashing through them, while the short sightlines of the cliffs mean that stunning them with your power pole is virtually impossible, as the aggressive enemies are bearing down on you. On top of this, the player must also quickly identify and eliminate the enemies that can call for backup, which threaten to produce insurmountable numbers of vicious, close-quarters enemies. These two design features, along with the need to sometimes backtrack when swarmed to avoid being overwhelmed, act as an excellent impediment to progress that does a great job amplifying the impatience and desperation of wanting to find Trip before she gets into trouble. Although this is relatively simple, I found this sequence to be one of the strongest sequences in the game, and I think it demonstrates very well the developer's understanding of using all elements of gameplay to service the particular moment of the story, while also demonstrating how certain gameplay elements can shine more in different contexts. The last sequence I want to mention occurs early in the game and is a little different. There is a simple and serene platforming sequence where Monkey chases a dragonfly, during which the game's colour palette is particularly striking. Platforming alongside the visual spectacle created by these strong reds and greens allows the player to absorb this sense of natural wonder that bolsters the thematic idea I've mentioned before of beauty emerging amidst dystopia, as well as giving a quiet moment for the player to reflect on the lore and story elements of the world around them, something which works particularly well at this point in the game when the player is trying to establish a foothold on what is happening in this post-apocalyptic setting. Through these examples, I hope it's clear how Enslaved may not have particularly deep gameplay systems that it is committed to building upon and progressing, but the game nonetheless does use the freedom it has from not doing this to wield its novel and diverse set of gameplay styles to serve the story as well as possible and however it sees fit, and often does this quite effectively. As I set my sights on wrapping up this review, I do have to wonder how disappointing it is that I cannot speak of Enslaved without reference to other games of its era. and I think this is ultimately the question that might linger after most players finish it. Nonetheless, Enslaved remains a simple but well executed example of an action game from the time. A linear story-driven game with large set pieces that gets a few things very right in a handful of places. Although I can't say it offers many highly memorable moments, even from a contemporary perspective, Enslaved still has relatively few flaws to disfigure it, and so what survives is quite a smooth and frustration-free experience.